today celebrated St. Thomas More's birthday with great style here. They had cake, they sang a 15th century or 16th century song. I'll have to ask my bride what that was. They sang Happy Birthday, and they actually reenacted St. Thomas More's beheading. The student who played St. Thomas More couldn't have picked a better student. Woody Shahadi, are you here? Okay, good. It was your son. But it was when they raised his head up, pulling him by his hair, it was striking. But nonetheless, just a little bit about the Chelsea Lecture before we begin and introduce our guest lecturer. Chelsea Lecture is an annual presentation dedicated to the life, faith, and thought of St. Thomas More and the spirit and culture that he nurtured in his home and among his friends. The lecture seeks to educate the community to live an integrated life, which seeks God in all things, places virtue at the forefront of all endeavors, and ennobles the local and national communities. When we inaugurated this lecture series, we had Dr. Gerard Wegemer of the University of Dallas in 2022, and last year we had His Excellency Bishop Thomas John Paprocki of the Diocese of Springfield in Illinois. This year, we are very honored and pleased to introduce Dr. Matthew Mehan. Dr. Matthew Mehan is the Associate Dean and Assistant Professor of Government for the Steve and Amy Van Andel Graduate School of Government on Capitol Hill. He has been teaching and designing humanities curricula for 20 years. Dr. Mehan is a graduate of the University of Dallas and the valedictorian of his class. He received a BA in Politics, an MA in English, and a Ph.D. in Literature with honors for his dissertation on Shakespeare, Thomas More, and the education of leading citizens. For the last 9 years, he has also taught courses for Hillsdale College's Washington Hillsdale Internship Program for undergraduates. He's a founding fellow of the Center for Thomas More Studies, and he has served as a fellow of the Shakespeare Folger Library in Washington, D.C. Dr. Mehan is also used to teach a 3-credit course in England every summer on Shakespeare and Thomas More. Dr. Mehan has consulted for national leaders and heads of state. He has written for various outlets, both scholarly and popular, including Moriana, the Wall Street Journal. He is also the author of The Handsome Little Cygnet, as well as Mr. Mehan's mildly amusing Mythical Mammals, both for sale immediately after the presentation. The latter is an illustrated, best-selling book of poems that one critic called a new classic. He and his lovely wife Molly and their passel of children live here in Herndon, Virginia. Passel is a word we need to bring back, so thank you for that. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mehan.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me, everyone. So, one additional sort of biographical note, I did study under your first speaker, Jerry Wegemer. He was the one who organized those Thomas More in England programs when he first reined me in just after graduating college. So I started teaching Thomas More as a sort of student assistant. And at the end of that first summer, he gave me his book, A Portrait of Courage, and said, "Hey, you might want to read this," which I did on a train to Oxford afterwards, sort of slumming around Europe for a little bit after the trip. And it's basically been Thomas More all the way down since. But it's worth noting, you know, the grandchild rule, right? Sort of the grandfather earns the fortune, and then the next child, you know, his son respects the fortune, and then the grandchild's kind of a disaster. Right? So I don't know if I'm the son or the grandson of Wegemer, you know, but you are sort of photocopy of a photocopy after Paprocki. But so we'll see what we can do tonight. But I do love Thomas More, and I've been studying him for a long time. And it's a privilege and an honor, and it's actually quite moving to read up on Chelsea and see how you guys have really sort of made a home for More. And in sort of keeping with the way you honor Thomas More, I wanted to just sort of lay out what I'm going to do, but also kind of say a couple sort of somewhat strange things about what I want to do tonight, which is I want to maybe share a few discoveries in More scholarship, and it seems like this is the appropriate place to do it. Chelsea Academy. I mean, this is a serious place, and you've got this speaker series, so I want it to be not just kind of a fun talk, but also like I'm going to drop a couple sort of new things in the scholarship that hopefully are going to be in the academic stuff afterwards, but hopefully not just for nerdery's sake, but actually for your sake. And then my hope is to sort of touch your conscience as parents by the end, by sort of introducing you to Thomas More, perhaps at a kind of closer look, another image of More, because he's dead. And so all we have are, in a certain sense, icons and images of More, and his writing, which in a certain sense is another image of More, and the writings about him. And so, you know, that's sort of the plan tonight. So it's going to be sort of all over. You've got a little handout I'm going to be referring to repeatedly. I like visual aids, so did Thomas More. He always insisted on illustrating everything. But you know, that's the plan for the evening. But before we begin, I wanted to sort of just take a survey, just a show of hands. How many of you take as your sort of guiding image of Thomas More A Man for All Seasons, either the book, the play, excuse me, by Robert Bolt, or the movie, the Oscar-winning movie? Just show of hands. How many would say that's the dominant image in your mind of More? Okay, probably half the room, maybe a little bit more. Maybe a few more won't admit it. But how many of you Portrait of Courage is the dominant? Jerry Wegemer's more recent book. A couple hands. And then I guess the question would be, what else? Aykroyd's biography, maybe? Or just a kind of, you know, another saint from the saints' books, right? The sort of Butler's Lives kind of account, like he fought the king, you know, for the church, and, you know, died because Henry was bad, right? Against the marriage of Anne Boleyn, right? Church of England, that kind of thing. Right, that's about it, right? Those are the dominant images of Thomas More. And they're good ones, and I don't mean to run them down. Man for All Seasons is what got me really seriously thinking about More. And I was headed to Washington, D.C. I had a job lined up with a senator. I was going to go be a Hill rat and go take the world by storm. I was that guy, student government president, Mr. Annoying, like ready to rock, right? And frankly, right, Thomas More in Man for All Seasons, Master Rich, be a teacher. Right? Maybe you're not morally ready for the big game in Washington. And I kind of did a little bit of an examination on that Thomas More in England program with Jerry Wegemer and went, Thomas More is an incredible human being, and I am nowhere close to him. And he trained for years before he entered the service of Henry and went and played in the big game. And I actually felt ashamed at the idea that I thought I was just it was gonna be great. I was just gonna go rock it in Washington. And I became a teacher. And I've never really looked back, although ironically now I am teaching a graduate school of government on Capitol Hill for a bunch of Hill staffers. So I'm kind of like right there, Gandalfing it. But I don't mean to run down Bolt's image, right? It's a very good one. And in fact, much of the scholarship you heard from Jerry Wegemer, and from Paprocki, frankly, from Bishop Paprocki, and from me tonight, those things were made possible by that play and the movie, because it generated such an explosion of interest in Thomas More that it is what caused the funding of the Yale Complete Works. For the first time, More's works were actually prepared out of crazy, musty manuscripts that barely anyone could read into actually workable volumes, which then became all the popular volumes which you might see in your religious bookstores or even mainline bookstores. So I don't mean to run it down, but I am going to run it down. You know, like the reason being, Bolt's an atheist. Right? Robert Bolt's an atheist. And as such, he wanted to use More to achieve a certain set of ends. Okay, right? And that's fine. He's free to do that. But it is worth noting, right, that there's something missing, something essential, and something that we think is the most honorable thing about Thomas More, i.e. his holiness, right, his faith, that is absent, at least in the intention of the author of that play and of that screenplay. He also wrote the screenplay. So, and what I want to try to do tonight is sort of not totally dismiss that image, because it's a beautiful one and there's much truth in Bolt's account of More. But I want to kind of push past it by focusing on a particular aspect of More that has been plowed under by that image. I'll tell you what it is sort of slowly and indirectly, but the first sort of text that I want to sort of walk through is the one right at the top next to More's Holbein. This is from Erasmus's letter to Van Hutten. When More published the Utopia, it was such an international sensation. They published another one the next year, and then two more the year after that. And it was basically the Harry Potter of continental Europe at the time. Like, everyone had to get a copy. What a wonderful thing, right? If that were our Harry Potter. Everyone had to get a copy of Utopia. But as a result, everyone wanted to know who this guy was. Who's Thomas More? What's he about? And so Erasmus, who'd been to his house a bunch of times, volunteered, I'll write up a kind of image of Thomas More. And this was in 1519, he wrote this letter, right after the 1518 edition of Utopia came out, which also was accompanied by about 260 epigrams. And those epigrams are featured here in the second column, in the second box here, from the Coronation Ode. So that's right, the last thing that was published in Europe by More are these poems along with Utopia. And this is Erasmus. So he says this beautiful thing: your love, then, of Alexander the Great or of Achilles, neither were those heroes more worthy of immortality. I will try to draw you a sketch. Now, if you're paying attention, that's a record scratch, right? What? Thomas More? An Alexander the Great or an Achilles? What on earth? What do Alexander the Great and Achilles have in common with Thomas More? Right? Well, Erasmus says, they're all three, and in fact, no less so, which could also mean more so, worthy of immortality. That is to say, they should be remembered for all time. They are great. There's a greatness that requires memory for all time, right? But then, it seems to me that's where the comparison sort of leaves off. What about Achilles and Alexander the Great? What do they have in common? Men of the sword, right? What is Achilles, the famous hero of the War, the Greek sacker of citadels, right? Destroyer of impregnable fortresses, right? That's what he did. He sacked all the citadels. He couldn't sack Troy, but he sacked all the other cities that Troy held, right? The unbeatable, ferocious, and angry hero, right? The rage of Achilles, right? So too Alexander the Great, right? He conquered the unconquerable cities, right? Through sheer sort of force of will and rapidity and ferociousness. So they're both conquerors of kingdoms and cities. They take down whole kingdoms and cities, right? Okay, so that doesn't sound like More, does it? Right? He wasn't a conqueror. In fact, he fought for peace. He fought against war quite a bit. He was as close to a peacenik as you can get without being one. What else are Achilles and Alexander the Great? What do they have in common? Well, it comes as kind of a funny little detail that Alexander the Great thought he was the descendant of Achilles, and actually when he went around, he kept almost like a sort of Ark of the Covenant with an ancient scroll of Homer's Iliad as the sort of ancestral right that he was like Achilles. So they both thought they were in the bloodline of this great, sort of, they thought they were gods, right? Descendants of gods, really, Greek heroes. But the other thing they have in common is they betrayed and slayed or killed their friends. Achilles refused to battle because he was having a little slap fight with Agamemnon about honors and various slaves that he wanted for his dignity and honor. And as a result, the Trojans were wasting the Greeks on the field of battle, and his best friend Patroclus, whose name, by the way, Patros Kleos, means the beautiful fatherland or the beautiful country, right? So his own country is also abandoned. He goes out to fight. Hector sees him in Achilles' armor, which he wore, because Achilles wasn't using it. He was lounging around, pouting at the beach, and slayed him, killed him. And that's what sent Achilles into his famous rage, where he slaughtered many of the Trojans and wrestled the rivers and, bit into Hector's flesh and dragged his body around the walls of Troy 3 times. The whole 9 yards, right? Alexander the Great, his best friend, who he set up with his sister and was now his best friend and brother-in-law, right? In a drunken rage after a battle at a drinking party in the tents, misheard some conversation and took it as a slight, drew his sword and slayed his best friend and brother in a drunken, stuporous rage. Well, Erasmus says in the same letter to Van Houten that Thomas More seemed born for friendship and knew how to make friends with everyone and never let a friendship go. Even if he couldn't reform the person, he said he didn't cut the knot of friendship. Think of Alexander the Great cutting the Gordian knot with a sword. Right? He would just merely loosen it so that they remained friends, but not close friends because he couldn't help him to virtue. So always maintaining connections of friendship with everyone and being an incredibly delightful, instructive, amiable, and active, serviceable friend at all times. Right? That's a weird comparison. I think what Erasmus is doing in the letter is kind of making a claim that More's greatness is like Achilles and Alexander the Great in a surprisingly hidden way, because he actually is the conqueror of citadels. And those citadels are the hearts of the people around him. And through conquering the hearts of the people around him, he conquers an entire kingdom, indeed a continent. Not with the sword, not by force, but by an incredible force of affection, of friendship, of charity, of love, and of wit. That is to say, he conquers through peace and wit. He doesn't conquer with the sword and bloodshed and violence. Words, not swords, as Shakespeare put it in his famous play called Sir Thomas More, the last discovered of Shakespeare's plays. So that's a pretty beautiful thing, which just raises this question: what is this wit of More's? Right? Because it's obviously something very important, so important that he can actually conquer, right? In a kind of holy way of friendship. So, look at the next description. This is still from the letter. I'm looking at the first box. Erasmus describing More in 1519 in this same letter. In shape and stature, More is not a tall man, but not remarkably short, all his limbs being so symmetrical that no deficiency is observed in this respect. Now, oftentimes people read this letter. I teach this letter a lot to students. Oftentimes they read the letter and they're like, what? Why? Like, imagine, like, could you give me a description of this man? There's no photographs. There's no real portraits. Like, could you tell me about him? And the first thing out of your mouth is, average height and all of his limbs are the same length as the other matching limb. Right? That's a laugh line. Like, it's actually funny. We're just sort of so removed. We're like, well, there were weird people back then. I'm sure this was normal. Like, no, it's not normal. Right? This is just funny. Right? Like, that's the opener. Right? Sort of like, his arms were of equal length. Right? Like, what? What are you doing? Right? So Erasmus is playing games. Right? But these guys never just play games to play games. Like, every game is delighting you so that it can instruct you. They never waste any part of the buffalo. Right? They're going to use it all. Right? So what are they up to? What's he up to? His complexion is fair, his face being rather blonde than pale, but with no approach to redness, sorry gingers, except a very delicate flush, which lights up the whole. His countenance answers to his character, having an expression of kindly and friendly cheerfulness, with a little air of raillery. Right? What does that mean? Like, raillery. A little bit of a mock. Like, he's maybe going to tease you. right? Like, he's gonna make fun of you a little. In fact, when he was Speaker of the House, Moore was known as Master Mock. Like, people were afraid if he like turned his gaze on you and just like, oh no, here it comes, right, in Parliament, right? But the way he mocked people, they were not 100% sure whether they were being laughed with or at any one time. He was the master teaser, but not in the way that is a bully's tease, but in a way that you sort of feel like, what are you doing? Something's happening. What do you, stop. I don't like this, but I don't feel too threatened, but ooh, oh, I'm being defeated, but I kind of see why, oh, ow, right? He was the genius at this. That was his name when he was Speaker of the House. That's why his name's Speaker of the House, I mean, in part. Master Mock. And he would defeat his enemies without destroying the friendship, right? A lot of people today in politics like to talk about the friend-enemy distinction. It's very sort of cool, right? Well, what if your political enemy is always your friend, right? How do you actually dispense with them, right, and defeat them? Moore thought about this and spent years translating Greek humorists and rhetoricians to try to figure out how to use wit and raillery, humor and mock, in a way that doesn't sever charity, but is a kind of power, right, of friendship and politics. To speak candidly, it is a face more expressive of pleasantry than of gravity or dignity. And he doesn't have the sort of aquiline, sort of Roman senator face. His right shoulder seems a little higher than his left. Wait a minute, didn't you say he was totally symmetrical? But now he's like, what, hunched on one side? Especially when he is walking. What? A peculiarity that is not innate, but the result of habit, like many tricks of the kind. So why would he just skip left arm day at the gym? Like, what's going on? Why does he have like a hump back on one side? Richard III hadn't been written yet when he wrote this, so it's not some reference to his famous history of Richard III with the crook back. Answer, he's a man of letters. The guy is writing all day and, frankly, all night. So he is yoked on one side because he is scribbling all day long for business, but also he gets up in the middle of the night and starts writing his humanist literature. That's how Utopia, that's how Richard III, that's how a lot of the famous poems, essays, treatises on the Passion, all these beautiful things, he wrote them at night. He got up and then he'd go back to sleep and then wake up with the family. So he's symmetrical. Why? Because he actually is, he has the Aristotelian mean, he has the virtues, right? He's an even, balanced man, right? But now, oh, by the way, that was kind of a joke. Yes, he's symmetrical, but he's also asymmetrical because he has beefed up this incredible pen to write and communicate with others, right? He's going to spend all of his energy with the pen to learn how to talk and communicate with others and use words to conquer. Unlike Achilles and Alexander, who were just mentioned in the previous paragraph of this letter. In the rest of the Bible, slightly English potty humor, which the continent was like, ooh, that's hideous, but think of Chaucer, right? It's a little bawdy, the English, and Moore had a few kind of funny, earthy poems, and I'm sure Erasmus didn't much care for them. But again, this is sort of weird. What is Erasmus doing? And this is what I want to share with you that I think, as far as I can understand, is a discovery in the literature. That I think what Erasmus is doing is actually giving an homage by kind of teasing and mocking Thomas More a little, like sort of playing with him, praising him a lot. But he's also telling More and others who had just read Henry's Coronation Ode, which is in that book I said in 1518 he published along with another edition of Utopia, and a lot of what's written in Utopia and those poems, he's actually signaling to everybody who read them, which is a lot of the people reading this letter, right, saying, I saw what you did, More, and it was a masterpiece. It's incredible. And what I want to do is basically take you through a couple passages of the Coronation Ode and show you those, right? And what I want to show you in particular is how doggone funny More is and how brave his humor is. We talk about comics going to like the National Press dinner, or whatever it's called, National Press Club dinner, and they like say something funny. Oftentimes it's sort of sycophantic to the president, depending on the politics, or it's like too cutting and mean, right? And it's like, oh, truth to power, oh, wow, right? And there's something actually kind of delightfully American about that, right? Sort of like the idea that a Joe Schmo citizen can sort of be like a court jester and get away with saying something to someone who has the nuclear football in their hand on drone strike power. And right, it's kind of a, yeah, we have rights still, like it's sort of, you don't get mad at me, right? There's something delightful about it, but it's often kind of mean, or it's just sycophantic suck up, right? Gosh, why are you so good all the time, President Obama, or whatever, you know, like gross, you know, like that kind of thing. It's not one or the other. But Moore, I want to show you, just briefly, Moore talks to Henry VIII in public, in his coronation ode, in a way that Henry can see, where he is mocking him. Not in the way that is cruel and causes him to hate him and never want to befriend him, but in the way that causes him to check himself before he wreck himself, right? Like, he's actually closing in with humor on Henry VIII's conscience as a live fire exercise in a publicly presented and published coronation ode in 1509, which he illustrated and sent to Henry in the court in 1509. I think it was 6 or 8 months late from the coronation, and he said, I'm sorry, I couldn't get it done in time because my illustrator had gout, and so I had to wait. Right, which is absurd, and whether it's true or not, it's just absurd that he would like share that, which is to alert Henry that I'm being funny, right? This is humorous, right? There's something silly and serious going on. Right? Moore is deadly serious about playing games, right? He plays the deadliest games, right? And by the way, Moore was very excited by language and etymology and stupid puns, right? A lot of the encomium after he died was punning like an Oxford Don, like he was the sort of king of the dad joke, like loved stupid puns, right? Well, his last name means fool in Greek. Morris means fool, right? So he saw himself as a kind of holy fool, or like a court jester before the king. Like he was, and as you remember from Shakespeare, it's the court jester who can get away with saying anything, because he knows it's a playful thing, but he can actually say the one thing that everyone else is afraid to say, but he says it in a jest. And so he can kind of present all kinds of opportunities if you have the wit, the genius, which by the way, genius is the Latin word, wit is the English word, it's the same word. If you have the wit to find the means to bring it forward to your friend, the king, even though he is a very dangerous man, right? So look at this section from the Coronation Ode, which I think Erasmus is riffing on, comparing Moore to Henry. It's prose, but it's the poem. This is the ode. It's from Latin. It's translated here. Among 1,000 noble companions, Henry VIII stands out taller than any. Right? So he's not of moderate height like poor Moore, right? The moderate man of virtues. He is a man of excesses or extremes, right? But this is praise. Moore is like, you're a big guy that gave you your corn-fed Iowa boy. Like you got the red meat, in the nursery at the palace. Like, so you're much bigger than the rest of us. And he has strength worthy of his regal person. You're jacked. His hand, too, is as skilled as his heart is brave. Okay, stop. Moore, I'm going to show you about 10 of these, but you got to see the first one. Moore does this all the time, right? If you're going to meet someone and you don't want to upset them, right, and you want to say something nice, but there's not a lot nice to say, right? Like, you're going to flub it up most of the time if you don't think about it hard beforehand, right? Moore thought about it all the time. He practiced for decades for these kinds of things, right? What did he just say? Like, what is the content of that phrase? His hand, too, is as skilled as his heart is brave. It's a comparison. What is the objective account of his heart's bravery or the skill of his hand? we don't know, right? Right? Like, we have no idea, right? So it sounds great, and if you're like, of course, this is a ode to me, you're praising me, like this is what's expected, right? So what's he saying? Not much, right? He's saying, you know, maybe he means you're brave in battle and you're good at swords. But he might also mean, hey, pay attention. I'm not sure this is really an important objective standard by which to praise a king who really shouldn't be in battle much at all, right? You don't want Eisenhower like charging the beaches at Normandy. Like that's the wrong place for the guy running the war, right? Whether there is an issue to be settled by the naked sword, or an eager charge with leveled lances, or an arrow aimed to strike a target. And by the way, everyone around Henry was like, oh, please don't. He would do these jousts and wrestling matches, and he'd actually like get concussions, and they're like, please, the royal person, right? So here's more like, isn't it great? He's rough and tumble, everybody, right? It's funny. It's actually funny. Like, it's seeably funny. But we, from our distance, were like, oh, it must be sort of stiff and sort of, you know, all choked. There is a fiery power in his eyes, Venus in his face. Like, okay, that's the goddess of desire. It's a woman. It's not awesome. That's sort of, you can imagine Henry reading this or having it read to him and going like, what? And such color in his cheeks as is typical of twin roses. Well, that's the Tudor rose, right? The Lancaster and the York, the two roses of the Civil Wars, which he now unites. So that's actually kind of rah-rah, like you present peace to us, like you've married the clans together in your person, so we're very hopeful. But to have roses in your cheeks is to say you're flushed, fiery, and very passionate, right? Again, sorry, gingers, right? I have a fiery red beard, which is, you know, makes me look much more Henry-esque than Morian, so I keep it shaved for these talks, and in general. In fact, that face, admirable for its animated strength, could belong to either a young girl or a man. What? This is a coronation ode presented to the King of England. Thus, Achilles looked when he pretended to be a maiden. Thus he looked when he dragged Hector behind his Thessalian steeds. Now that's when he lost his mind with rage and anger, right? And committed atrocities against the rules of even Greek just war theory, which was pretty loosey-goosey back then, right? That is not a compliment. That is a warning to Henry. Don't give in to the lusts of war, battle, and anger and contest among princes in Europe. Stay at peace. Stay calm. But it's not peace Nicky. He's not just a dove. Because he also says, like the maiden, right? Achilles, because you might not know the story. Why would you? I don't know. Achilles, at one point, didn't want to go to the war. Like, he didn't want to fight. He wanted a peaceful life, right? So he actually hid as a virgin in this temple, and right, just refused to engage his duty because he had a duty to the king, right? So either the white rose of the Yorkists, right, which is pale and not enough energy to do what your duty, or the red rose of the Lancastrians, which is too much rage and aggression and tyrannical impulses to go full, sort of empire, right? He's saying, you have those kinds of cheeks. You've got both Lancastrian and Yorkist blood. You have both tendencies. You have both habits, and you need to mind them both and blend them and hit the mean. But you're not really much of a mean right now, young prince. Those are discernible mocks, right? But they're also mixed with praise, right? You are strong. You are the hope of peace because you bind these two. We're rooting for you, buddy. But be careful. Ah, if only nature would permit that, like his body, the outstanding excellence of his soul be visible to the eye. Right. Now that's the translator that says that he's talked with him. They have looked at telescopes on the roof of his house. Like, he has tutored him even informally. And he is a very delightful companion to Henry. So it's not that he's just coming out cold. He has a relationship, but he is taking a liberty and a little bit of a risk with that relationship in a pretty powerful and potent way. To that end, before I continue, I want to show you a little bit more about the Coronation Ode. Look at the picture at the bottom here. This is a picture of Erasmus is behind More. More's on his knee. He's actually at the nursery. It's not little baby. Henry's, preteen or teen there. He's at the nursery of Henry VIII. And he visited the nursery and spoke to Henry and spoke to his tutors about Henry's education. And after repeated visits, he and Erasmus were both very concerned that Henry was being surrounded by flatterers, right? That the raising of this young leader was actually, he was being poisoned because there was too much praise. There was not the misuse of praise, right? Which, as a parenting matter, you should tell your children you love them, right? That's all the time. Like, that's gratis. That's not praise, right? That's actually their relationship and their identity. They're a beloved child of yours, right? Praise is a little different. That you should use sparingly and carefully, right, with your child, and usually mix it when you probably have to give them a criticism as well, right? It's time. You mix the sweet with the sour, right? I love you is just the meat and broth of parenting, right? Affection, love, time, right? Just enjoyable conversation. Praise is mixed with criticism, right? Because you got to do a lot of that as a parent, and kids will get dispirited. So you save all the sugar for when you need it, right? More and Erasmus knew this, and they were very worried about Henry being destroyed and becoming tyrannical because he was just used to having everybody say, well done, Henry, excellent, right? That kind of thing. So much so that those two presented Plutarch, the famous historian and moralist, twice illuminated manuscript versions, which may be sort of collapsed, represented here. He didn't do it when he visited the nursery, he did it afterwards, but I think they sort of compressed those two moments. Twice they presented two different illuminated copies, Erasmus and More, to Henry and his court and his tutors at different times, different people, but How to Tell a Flatterer from a Friend, this famous essay about how to really know who your friends are. It turns out your friends are people who are willing to, without being mean and cruel, are willing to tell you where you don't quite add up, right? Where you need to improve, right? I.e. a friendship of true virtue, not one of mere pleasure, right? Which is, at the end of the day, not much of a friendship at all. So he says at the bottom of the box, unlimited power has a tendency to weaken good minds. This is in the Ode. And that even in the case of very gifted men. Right? So there's straight up moralia in the Ode too. But what I want to read is right after this section that I read you about Achilles and Hector being dragged around, is just a few items from the Ode that follows. Right after he says these words that I read to you a moment ago, which is, if only nature would permit that, like his body, the outstanding excellence of soul were visible to the eye in him. I mean, you look great. Now complement those great wolfish looks with great virtues of a king, my king. Right? That's where you got to go next. It's pretty tough. And right after he says that, he says, and this is the translator from Yale, but I'm going to show you how the Yale guy doesn't see More as funny. And I know Clarence Miller, he passed away. Jerry and I had him for conferences for years, and he's like this wonderful, the sweetest man. I'm going to do an imitation, but he's the sweetest man on earth. But he's like, I just don't see, Jerry, why Thomas More would ever dare mock a king. Like, it's just a straight poem of praise. It's Tudor propaganda, that's all it is. And we're like, really? Calling your king Achilles the woman? Right? Are you serious? Calling him Achilles the rage monkey? Right? You've got to be kidding me, right? And we just banged away at him for years. But he translated this line, if only nature would permit that, like his body, the outstanding excellence of his soul be visible to the eye. But I think I'll give you a different one. If only an excelling of his soul could be discerned with the virtues of his body, nature not prohibiting. Right? And then, this is back to the Yale. Nay, but in fact his virtue does shine forth from his very face. His countenance bears the open message of a good heart, revealing, and you're like, oh, that's pretty good. Open message of a good heart. Great. Revealing what? And then he has this list. And in the Latin, it's quoque, quanta, quam. Different versions of how or how much. So he reveals, listen up, how ripe the wisdom that dwells in his judicious mind. Well, how ripe? Is he wise? No, it's by degree again. There's no substantive account. How profound the calm of his untroubled breast. Well, how untroubled is it? Right? You just said he gets flushed a lot. How he bears his lot and manages it, whether it be good or bad. How great his care for modest chastity. More's already very concerned about that with Henry VIII, by the way. How serene the clemency that warms his gentle heart. How far removed from arrogance his mind. Of these, the noble countenance of our prince itself displays the indubitable signs. Looks good. Question is, are the signs signifying the truth of character? He's a beautiful prince. And then the last line, signs that admit, and this is the translator from Yale, no counterfeit. But that's not actually what the Latin says. Meaning these signs can't be counterfeited, so they're truly what Henry is. That's how people think Moore was just writing a suck-up poem, right, praising the king to get in good because he likes to wheedle his way up to power. That's how a lot of people read Moore's Coronation Ode. But what he really says in Latin is, quas fingere non est, which, if you know your old Latin letters, and by the way, most everyone reading this, including Henry, would have known this is from Cicero's On Duties and from Seneca's Epistles. Fingere means to fashion, and it's the idea that you have to fashion your character like clay, right? That you have to do the work of making your character, right? The Latin says, right, these signs, right, which are not fashioned, they're not made yet. Now, if you're not paying attention, right, and most people aren't when they're listening to a poem being read for the first time, like, oh yeah, this is lots of praise. If this is your coronation ode and you're Henry and this is your friend and you know he messes with you all the time and you've already been alerted a few times, you're going to start reading very carefully, right? And you'll be like, dude, ouch. You just said I don't have the virtues yet. You're not ready, Henry. That's what he told his friend, the king, at his coronation ode, or, after, a few months after, because of gout in the Illustrated, right? That is incredibly brave and bold. And it's funny. Like, he is mocking the king in front of other people, to the king, to getting the king to kind of laugh at himself. Like, come on, you're 17, man. Like, grow up. Like, you got a lot to do, right? And you look great. You look great, king. Looking great. When you think of Boltzmann for All Seasons, those of you who have seen the movie or read the play, Thomas More comes off as sort of like, quiet Meg, hold. He's sort of nervous and serious all the time. Moore referred to himself as a jiglet. He said, my worst fault. I cannot stop laughing. I cannot stop it. I'm like a jiglet. What's a jiglet? Anyone ever been to like Mexico or Central America? The street vendors have these, sometimes a wooden frog with a wooden stick, and you go over it and it rivets, right? But the jiglet was an old wooden denture that was sold by the handicrafts in London, and still to this day in Mexico City I've seen them. So they're wooden dentures that when you open them, one part of the wood squeezes against the other and goes, and so then people are like, right? That's how Moore describes himself. Right? So if you want an image of Moore, take one of Moore's sort of proffered images of himself. I am a jester. I am a fool. I am funny. I am a friend. I'm an unstoppable giglet. Like, I cannot stop laughing, and I want you to laugh with me at yourself, right? And me, because, by the way, to present an ode 8 months later, whatever it was, because of like the fat illustrator who was like slow and gouty and overeating, so he couldn't get it done. Like, I'm sorry, I'm late. I can't keep up, right? Like, that's like a Columbo bumbling. Like, it's a joke. It's funny. It's like you sort of like come in like with a shirt tail out, like, what, King? Here's your ode, right? Not really, but it's the Elizabethan or Tudor equivalent. It's funny. That's something I want you to see about Moore that gets missed in the stained glass windows and the very serious accounts of Moore. Because he was deadly serious, but he took funny, he took wit, humor, genius, he took it very seriously. Right? So that's just kind of a curiously strange thing about him. So much so that when Shakespeare and Shakespeare and 5 other playwrights got together to write an encomium to him in 1599, this is the equivalent of if someone had been like unjustly beheaded by Lyndon Johnson or something, or executed, given the chair for treason, even though everybody kind of knew he was innocent, right? And it was kind of this horrible coup. Like Christopher Nolan and Michael Bay and Spielberg, like all the major directors get together and produce a huge mega like Gladiator level, feature length, like high production film about that guy, while presidency that has all power, right? And there's no more Congress, right? That's what happened in 1599 when Shakespeare, Anthony Munday, Henry Chettle, Decker, Heywood, a bunch of the famous playwrights all got together and submitted it to the censors, the Master of Revels under Queen Elizabeth, the daughter of Henry VIII, after Henry had killed Moore, right? Because they wanted to show this guy they thought was such an amazing person, that he represented the best of what England and London was, even in this time of trouble. Right? And the central point in the play is a play within the play called The Marriage of Wit and Wisdom. That's the central sort of feature of the play. And in it, Moore puts on this play, for the Lord Mayor, who needs some serious help because he's actually kind of a lazy, cowardly loser who's afraid of Henry and doesn't actually take care of the people of London and lets a lot of things burn physically and literally and figuratively in England. And so Moore's like, you need to learn what real justice looks like, right? You need some more wisdom in your cleverness. And in it, one of the actors is late to the show. He lost a prop. And so during the show, Moore has to step in to this Marriage of Wit and Wisdom play when Wit, the character Wit, this sort of young, funny, punning creature, thinks he's marrying Lady Wisdom, because he's like, I want to marry Wisdom, like I'm a young lad, I want to be wise in the world. But he's actually been lied to, it's Lady Vanity or Lady Folly from the Book of Proverbs, right? And Moore hops in as good counsel, the character that's missing. And of course he's got the play memorized. But he says this is what Wit says when Moore like steps out of the audience and starts playing the role to fill in. Art thou good counsel, and wilt tell me so? Wouldst thou that Wit from Lady Wisdom go? Like, you're not gonna ask me to leave this beautiful woman, who's like, by the way, kissing him all the time, like kind of like too forward, right? Lady Wisdom's harder to get than Lady Folly, right? Thou art some deceiver, I tell thee verily, in playing that this is Lady Vanity, or in saying that this is Lady Vanity. And here's more, playing the part of good counsel. Right? Wit, judge not things by the outward show. The eye oft mistakes, right well you do know. Good counsel assures thee upon his honesty that this is not wisdom but lady vanity. Right? Wit, do not judge by the outward show. I think maybe this might even be a reference to that coronation ode, right? Henry, young, foolish, witty lad who wants to get married, right, and wants to be wise and good, because I think Moore's not joking in the ode when he says, you have a good heart, Henry. You could be very good. You want excellence. You want to be a good king. And I think Moore thought that of Henry. He knew he had terrible tendencies. He knew he'd been corrupted by flatterers. But he also knew that he had a kind of good, youthful, earnest desire to do good and great things. Right? Don't give in to appearances. Right? You have to have the wit to see the other side of things. I submit to you, by the way, that is one of the things that wit does, and why Thomas More was so good at seeing what needed to be done next and at communicating it to others, is he had the kind of wit, the kind of genius, the kind of humorous mind that could see the pun, could see the double meaning, could see the backside of this thing, could see how it could be played in a different way, right? To see multiple options. Right? And by the way, wit, if you think it's kind of like, yeah, it's just for smart people. No, Aristotle says it's actually a moral virtue. You have to practice it. You got to get good at it. Being funny is part of how you treat other people well. It's also part of how you judge things rightly. And I think what Moore teaches us is that kind of wit, right? That kind of friendly, cheerful, humorous way, which he had to the nth degree, and frankly, none of us will be as funny as that man, right? He's calling us to practice that virtue. Look at the last little section on the first page, next to the tutor and Erasmus. I have no idea what time we actually started, John.
Keep going.
This is from the play, Sir Thomas More, that I just mentioned that Shakespeare co-wrote with all those guys, at great risk to his life. By the way, the censors didn't say just, oh yeah, we didn't like your play, so you can't show it. They did do that. But sometimes they're like, we didn't like your play so much that we're going to torture you with an inch of your life and then release you to die among your friends in a hostel, which is what playwrights happened just months before this one was submitted. So this was not an uncourageous act on the part of Shakespeare and others. This was dangerous. And again, like witty, dangerous game. I think following Moore's example, right? They knew Moore was a great literary genius and a great man. They're doing the same thing. This play is an homage, but so is the sort of that mode of playing jester to the hearts of men that you see so often in Shakespeare's plays. But look at this. See where my father comes, joyful and merry. This is after he's just resigned his office and knows he's going to go to prison and maybe die because he can't swear the oath and can't sign the articles. Here's more. As seamen having passed a troubled storm, dance on the pleasant shore, so I could speak now like a poet. Now, afore God, I am passing light. Wife, give me a kind welcome. Thou hast wont to blame my kissing when my beard was in the stubble, but I have been trimmed of late. I have had a smooth court shaving. In good faith I have. The daughters kneel for their blessing. God bless ye. Son Roper, give me your hand. Your honor's welcome home. Honor? And how dost, wife? Roper says. He bears himself most strangely. Right? He's home. He's getting ready to be persecuted, probably drawn and quartered, or so he thought. The most horrifying pain. What does he choose to do? Jest and joke. And so he did. By the way, the play follows history. You realize, maybe, I'm kind of curious, a show of hands, but how many of you know that Moore famously joked on the scaffold? He cracked a bunch of jokes. Scandalized people. They're like, what on earth? This is just awful. You can't do that. You can't tell jokes. Right? But he did. He's like, oh, please don't cut my beard off. It hath not offended the king. Well, he was dying. Right? That's what he said. And he also says, like, oh, help me up. He's so weak, right, from being in prison. He's like, but I'm sure I'll shift for myself on the way down. Like, that's the kind of stuff he was doing the last seconds of his life, right? What on earth? People said he's lost his senses. The sin of his treason has caused him to lose his senses, the fool. Right? Or something else. The play wants you to see a man who knows how to be funny and cheerful, even under the darkest circumstances. Wild. Wild. And it does sort of present a problem. Look at the back page. Because here's more in the tower, in the dialogue of comfort against tribulation. Right? But this I say yet again and again, that as for the far better thing in this world toward the getting of the very good that God giveth in the world to come, the Scripture undoubtedly so commends us to tribulation, meaning to undergo suffering and trials, that in respect and comparison thereof it discommends this worldly wretched wealth and discomfortable comfort utterly. For to what other thing soundeth the words of Ecclesiastes that I rehearse to you now, that it is better to be in the house of heaviness than to be at a feast? Whereto soundeth the comparison of his, that the wise man's heart draws thither, as folk are in sadness, and the heart of a fool is there, as he may find mirth. Whereto draws this thread of the wise man, that he that delighteth in wealth shall fall into woe. Laughter, says Quohellet, right, from the Old Testament, laughter, says the wise man, shall be mingled with sorrow, and the end of mirth is taken up with heaviness. And our Savior himself says, woe be to you that laugh, for you shall weep and wail. But he says on the other side, blessed be they that weep and wail, for they shall be comforted. And he says to his disciples, the world shall joy, and you shall be sorry. But your sorrow shall be turned into joy. And so it is, you know well now. And the mirth of many that then were in joy is now turned all to sorrow. And thus you see by the Scripture plain that in matter of very comfort, tribulation is as far from prosperity as the day is above the night. It's inappropriate to laugh at your death, isn't it? It's inappropriate to try to be cheerful in your house when things are so dire, isn't it? Know your place. Isn't this Thomas More, the guy who in Utopia said, act your part? Do not start a tragedy in a comedy, and do not try to start a low comedy in the middle of the serious political matter of a high tragedy. Right? Don't be a fool. Isn't he being a fool? And these are his own words in the tower. By the way, he even rehearsed his imprisonment. He paid someone to come knock on the door all scary-like to test his daughters, right? And they freaked out and started blubbering and screeching and crying, and the door opened, and it was a friend. And he's like, that didn't go well, ladies. Like, would we like to bear ourselves famously in dignity? Why don't we practice this again, right? Like, what? What are you doing? What kind of person is this? Well, it turns out, right, there's different kinds of mirth. There's different kinds of funny, and there's different kinds of joy. And clearly this is an earthly joy, a kind of selfish joy. Cicero says, in the De Oratore, one of More's favorite books, and Cicero's considered probably the pagan that More tried to imitate. That's genius. It's funny. It makes the, because how do you defeat an enemy? Aristotle says in the Sophistical Refutations, right? Get them to repeat themselves until they sound absurd to themselves and everyone else around them. Try them and your kid, right? Some garbage pail lie that they're clearly lying about having stolen the cookie or whatever, and you're like, tell it to me again. And then they go again, and you're like washing the dishes, like, tell me again? And like the fourth time, they're like, okay, I did it. Like, there are more ways than one to skin a cat. And then this, the one on the far right is the pediment, on the eastern face of the House of Representatives. And it's Peace is the woman, and her hand is protecting that little boy who's holding a fire, which is the symbol of the immortal soul, the mind of man given by God. And it's the statue is called Peace Protecting the Genius or Wit of Democracy. I didn't get into it in this talk, but part of what I refer to more as one of the founding grandfathers of this country, because one of the things he did, and I think he did it very much on purpose, was teach this habit to the British and a lot of the other habits of the arts of liberty and self-government in his writings and in his way. Because what does it say when you joke at someone who's above you? If you joke to your teacher or to your dad or to your boss, and you're sort of like crack one, and you're like, did it work? You know, like, ooh, right? What do you call that? Say, he took a liberty. There's only two ways to take liberties: with the sword, or with humor and wit, with words. And More wanted he wanted the Brits to take liberties by convincing kings and lords to give it to them, because they could see how absurd their position of tyranny was. That was More's project, and I think in the end, rough road, a lot of it succeeded. He seeded all these concepts and these habits into the British mind. You can find the rights in our Declaration and our Constitution and in the Declaration of the Liberties of Englishmen in More's utopia. He knew what he was doing. Very witty man. And then last but not least, special pleading. That's the Christian humanist caduceus that More used in Utopia, but redesigned by me and my illustrator for America with red, white, and blue and some other things, which that's a whole other talk some other time. John can help me out and I can talk about that. I'll leave it there. All right, I have time to...
Thank you so much, Dr. Mehan.